We now welcome senior podcast producer of The Athletic and new creative lead and producer of Shattered, Hope, Heartbreak, and the New York Knicks. We welcome Mike Smeltz onto Hoopsology. How's it going, Mike?
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's going great. Thank you for being so patient too. We tried to set this up quite a long time ago, and I kind of got in production mess with Shattered, and then paternity leave. So I'm glad to be with you all right now. This is great.
No worries. The timing worked out perfect. The season's about to begin, so it's perfect timing. So
Yeah,
I listened to the podcast as we discussed off there. Big fan of it.
thanks.
Matt and I are from the West Coast, so just to get kind of the sensibility of a New York Knicks fan was just excellent insight. So I just wanted to kind of ask you, what was the origin in creating this project, and what are kind of the struggles and challenges that you experienced? Because taking on this project must have been very daunting for you. I mean, the New York Knicks, this has so many different angles to go in. So
Yeah.
how did you get started, and what were kind of the challenges you experienced?
Yeah, so for anyone who's listening who maybe doesn't know, we did this podcast series, narrative podcast series about the past 20 years of the Knicks. So all the time under James Dolan, basically. And sort of the source of it was that um, so many people talk about, every regime changed with the Knicks. Dolan's kind of blamed for the bad things that happened, whether justifiably or unjustifiably. But I always felt like it was always just like a cycle of he's blamed for someone getting fired, the person's fired, they go on, they bring in a new regime, whether it's like Phil Jackson or Donnie Walsh. There's some hope. There's definitely like that's kind of the thing about the Knicks is that they haven't been hopeless. There has been moments. Jeremy Lin, Kristaps Porzingis, Marbury when he did get traded to the Knicks was exciting. But no one's ever kind of done the full picture of James Dolan's time as the owner of the Knicks, and we really kind of went to dig into like what that looked like. And within that, obviously, that wasn't the entire focus, but that was like a big focus because he's the owner of the team, and he's a different type of owner than maybe some other ones. Some interesting, and there's a lot of great stories about him, but also we kind of wanted to figure out, why have the Knicks not been able to consistently win since Patrick Ewing left? And when Patrick Ewing left does coincide with when James Dolan basically comes in. So there's like a nice time element to that. So we dove into that, and there's a lot to talk about. It's a lot of people that have been through the garden in that time frame. And the one really nice part of it was, and I know we'll talk more about the series, but we ended up getting Chuck D from Public Enemy to be the host, and Chuck is, I mean, a legend. He's a massive Knicks fan. Like there's like the Knicks fan TV is this big YouTube Knicks TV show. It's a YouTube show, and Chuck's in the comments, like commenting
Yeah,
along with the show. He's a big. So
Awesome.
working with him was like amazing because he is like the level of talent that he has for saying words is beyond anything that I think I'll ever work with again. I mean, he's literally one of the greatest, orators in rap history, and he's doing, reading the words that I wrote, which was just like an ultimate thrill. It was amazing, you know.
so, in talking with Chuck D, what is his own sensibility as like a Knicks fan? Because you hear Max
Yeah.
Kellerman on these talking head shows, and it's like you're enabling the Knicks by selling out these home games all the time. So, from a Chuck D perspective of just sticking with it and just supporting a team no matter what was kind of his sensibility in terms of the material you gave him? Does he have an optimistic attitude always about the team, or is there kind of some like bitterness and some kind of despair in terms of working with him, in terms of kind of going over this historical content with the Knicks?
No, he's an optimistic guy, and he's like real practical as a fan. If I like, he was really just like about like the funny thing was we talked a lot about drama on the show. Like, there's so much behind the scenes drama that we threw into the podcast, but like he as a fan is really like, I care about the on court product. I just want them to play defense. So this past year, we were recording it
Mm,
during the Tibbs revival, which is
mm.
like kind of bad timing, sort of, to do a podcast about how bad the Knicks are when they have their best season since the 54 win Melo J.R. Smith Knicks. Um, and like they seem stable right now. But Like Chuck is like just a hardcore, like, I just want to see them make layups, play defense. Like I don't want, divas on my team and that type of thing. He's great. I mean, what was great about him was that like there were multiple times when maybe I wrote something or like we were using a clip from an interview where like I wouldn't even say it was like too harsh or anything, but just that he was like he was basically like it was like he had the truth because he was a fan. So he knew if there was something that was like off, he could just say like, "Hey, like this isn't even what necessarily happened," which is great. It was basically having one of the world's biggest Knicks fans plus this like incredible, you know, this person who just had an amazing ability to speak. I mean, it's hard, we all speak for a living at times, but actually doing it and reading words off a page, that's a hard thing to do. And he's the greatest at it, honestly. There's no one better.
Mike, before I pass it on to Matt, I had another question about the podcast series, and that was about the section on Jeremy Lin.
Sure.
What was that like reliving that period of time? Because I think it's one of my favorite parts of the documentary, just seeing his rise, seeing, Barack Obama talk about him,
Yeah.
seeing just like him going from just sleeping on a teammate's couch to going, toe to toe with Kobe, and Kobe denying that he like knew about this phenomenon of Jeremy Lin. I thought that was hilarious. So I just, what was that period like, and what do you think of Jeremy Lin's career afterwards? Because there just seems to be, I don't know, I get the sense there seems to be a lot of resentment towards him, kind of, which I don't understand because I think it's such a inspiring story just to see this player come from obscurity and for him to achieve the success, but yet even his teammates were kind of out to sabotage him in the grand scheme of things. So, what was that kind of experience like? You reliving that time and telling that story again.
Yeah, so I was living in New York, so I'm not a Knicks fan. So, but I was living in New York at the time. I was working for a radio station there. And I remember it was a news radio station. And Jeremy Lin was such a big, I mean, such a massive deal that like, we'd be sending reporters to Chinatown and you'd be interviewing people and it'd be the lead story, this basketball player. But then when I look back on it, it was really only like 3 weeks,
Yeah.
Linsanity. And it is kind of mind-boggling how big Linsanity was. I mean, it was a global event that ignited, like, brought people that typically, aren't maybe fans of basketball or don't really get noticed as fans of basketball. They brought them to the forefront, and it was only 3 weeks, and then it ended. He got hurt, and then he was off the team to the Houston Rockets because the Knicks didn't want to pay up. And what was so wild about that is if there's one thing you can say about James Dolan is that he will pay money to make his team better. He will do whatever it takes. He will pay Phil Jackson $12 million a year, and then he'll fire him before that contract's up and pay someone else to take over the team. He will, the Knicks, I think for the first time last year was like the first time since they signed, I forget who it was, when they had like real double salary cap space for max free agents. Like they've always been over the luxury tax. They had under Isaiah, they had the most expensive team in NBA history when Isaiah was running the team until the Warriors broke that record, like only like 4 years ago.
Jeez.
And but with amongst all of that, Jeremy Lin, they didn't want to overpay for Jeremy Lin. And I never well, we kind of did get people to end up saying this. I mean, we interviewed Landry Fields, Steve Novak, and Jared Jeffries, who were all these ascendant role players with Jeremy as Linsanity happened. Like what made that team click was that Amari and Melo were hurt. Lin takes over because they need someone to take the scoring. He comes out and he hits fire, and obviously Novak was there. Novak is a big stretch shooting five who was hitting threes. Jared Jeffries was like the more I talked about him to other people, they were like he was super critical because he could play defense and all that stuff. And Landry Fields, of course, was a really good player for the Knicks for a short period of time. They all basically said that there was resentment in the locker room. They wouldn't say it was Carmelo, but like you can infer it was Carmelo, and that's nothing new to Jeremy Lin, and that it was very shocking to them how quickly it all ended. I mean, not only did Jeremy Lin leave for the Houston Rockets, D'Antoni got fired before the season was over. Again, this is Linsanity was the peak of Knicks happiness post Patrick Ewing, short-lived, but the coach who engineered that happiness gets fired before the season's over. It's just,
Man.
and like, so Linsanity to me is really the perfect example of why the Knicks haven't been good. Because sometimes people say the Knicks haven't been good because they've been unlucky, right? Like they actually haven't, since Patrick Ewing, they haven't done well in the lottery ball bouncing, right? Like they'll be just outside the pick. Like obviously Steph Curry is the most prominent example, but there's been so many times if you look at their drafts, like they're just a pick away from a superstar, right? But they got lucky with Lynn. And regardless of how his kind of career turned out, because he did get hurt a bunch, so that kind of sapped him of his abilities. Like they got lucky with Lynn, and then they just let it go. And they had Mike D'Antoni, who I think is probably the best modern coach to not have won an NBA championship. He's had an amazing record, particularly with scoring guards.
Yeah.
And they fire him. And so and that was, there's actually a bunch of different stories about why D'Antoni got fired. Some people say like D'Antoni just walked away because he knew it wasn't right for him. Some people say there was Carmelo that was motivating it, and some people say it was James Dolan or a mix of all three. It doesn't. In the end, he didn't stay. So Linsanity was the most Knicksian type moments. But again, it was also awesome. It was like talking to Landry Fields. He talked about, Lynn sleeping on his couch, the famous couch story. And it's, those are fun things to relive and hear about because it was such an exciting, almost innocent time, and Knicks
Totally
expand them.
Totally. And I wanted to dive a little bit more into James Dolan with you there, because I do remember distinctly, like when they bring in Phil Jackson, there was a lot of heat on James Dolan after the team was unsuccessful, had a rough start to that season, if I'm remembering right. But I do remember James Dolan saying, which most would consider pretty admirable. He was taking a hands-off approach. He said, I gave control of this team to Phil Jackson. I need to let him do his thing. In the past, there was a very friendly relationship with Isaiah Thomas for a while there, potentially to the detriment of the team. Has James Dolan always had this consistent hands-off ownership approach throughout his tenure there, or has that been kind of a roller coaster ride?
It's been a roller coaster ride. I mean, it is it is somewhat accurate that like Dolan did, he 100% said, like I think he almost literally said, I'm hiring Phil so you all know that I don't have anything to do with this team. The one thing I'll say about that is that, so I got to interview, which is one of my favorite things I got to get through the research process, was I got to talk to Clarence Gaines Jr., who was the VP of pro personnel with the Knicks. He was basically Phil's right-hand man in Phil's front office. He was the only guy that Phil actually got to hire at a high level in the front office when Phil came in. I'm trying to think who was still there, like at the time. Like there was multiple people that were still there that just stayed over for the previous regimes. And it's one of those things where it's like, Phil is told you have full range to do whatever you want, but he couldn't. Most guys, when they come in to, or women in the future, when they come in to an organization, they end up kind of firing everybody and
clean house,
bringing in their staff. And that's like, that stinks, but that is kind of what you need to do to change culture. Phil didn't do that. And partly it was explained. Ian Begley from SNY, he talked to me, who's awesome. He explained to me like, well, Phil didn't really have people because he's never did the job. He was just a coach. But as I talked to Clarence Gaines, it was like Phil literally only hired Clarence and was told to basically keep on the rest of the staff. So how much was he really fully resetting the deck when he came in? That is still sort of like a small way that James Dolan impacted how that franchise went forward. But it didn't necessarily mean it was bad. It was just that Dolan, even when he was hands off, still set up a system so that he was semi in control. But he was there's a great story, and this wasn't on our podcast. I mean, we retell it, but I'll give credit to Adrian Wojnarowski. He had Carmelo Anthony on his podcast, and Melo tells the story of how he got traded to the Knicks, and it is All-Star Weekend, Los Angeles. The Nets offer like Derek Favors, I think at that time would have been Devin Harris, and 4 first-round picks to the Nuggets. That's like All-Star Weekend morning. And Carmelo and his people basically tell the Knicks, like, hey, if you really want me, you need to like make an offer. Donnie Walsh is running the team at that point. Donnie is basically pushed aside. I mean, he is. And Dolan works the deal with Masai Ujiri, who was running the Nuggets at the time. And Masai, of course, we all know, fleeced the Knicks.
Yeah.
And I asked Donnie about that. Now, Donnie's like the nicest, and he's on the podcast. He's like the nicest guy in the world, and he's kind of famous for never throwing anyone under the bus, even though he's long gone from the Knicks at that point. And he kind of like, no, I mean, you're always talking to the owner, right? Like he said, if you're making a big deal, you're always talking to the owner. But Carmelo literally describes James Dolan negotiating the trade. So, I mean, that's an unusual thing for an NBA owner. And Dolan did that much more earlier in his tenure in the early 2000s, early 2010. He has taken a much more hands-off approach. And for Knicks fans now, it seems like he's not involved. It seems like it's Leon Rose and Worldwide Wes. But there's even potential issues with them going forward that we just don't know yet.
Going back to that Carmelo Anthony trade, I mean, it was so controversial at the time, and especially, Justin is near the Denver area right now. We have a lot of friends in that area. I know plenty of Nuggets fans who just are of the mind that they will not forgive Carmelo Anthony,
they hate him.
and there were some brutal games before he left. I think it's tough. Do you think, in the research you've done and just as a basketball fan in general, is there a way that a player can initiate a trade without? What would be the best way to control the damage? Because there's always going to be emotion. There's always going to be hurt feelings, right? My mind goes to what's going on with Ben Simmons right now, which has been, kind of a train wreck type of story the past couple weeks. Mostly because maybe there weren't other stories until this past weekend. But anyway, damage control. What do you think is maybe the best way in the modern NBA to kind of control some of that damage?
I think it's uncontrollable, right? Like, we've seen every variation of a star saying I want out, and all of it's ugly. Anthony Davis's situation, it was ugly. I mean, the guy, would stop playing basketball essentially and didn't want to be there. And Anthony Davis seems to be as nice as you could be. And he just he was like, I want to go to LA. James Harden, goes unmasked to a party in Vegas and then shows up and not like fully in shape. But he was also honest from the very beginning with the team and said, I wanted to be traded. And I blame the team for that situation because they literally were telling people, I remember Tim McMahon from ESPN reporting this, that they were willing to get uncomfortable with James Harden. James Harden told you what he wanted, and he created uncomfortableness. And then, so like it's a no-win situation ultimately. But then again, I think most of the players, like, I think they now have seen it enough where they all realize, like, it's going to not be fun for X amount of months, and then I'm going to leave. The Ben Simmons thing is interesting because, as a million people have said, no one has ever asked out this early into a contract of that magnitude. So, in Philly, I live right outside Baltimore, DC. I know a lot of people from Philly. It's super tough town. They're not going to forgive him for this. So, like, there's no winning. With Carmelo, what was interesting was I got to talk to George Karl, who was the Nuggets head coach, and Karl is bitter. Like, he is still bitter about what Carmelo did. And he said, like, Carmelo isn't a bad guy, but how he handled the situation. He was like, I had guys coming into my office begging me to have Masai trade Carmelo because the situation was getting so bad. And he was like, "Is nothing that Carmelo technically did wrong. It's not like he was like being a malcontent. It was just the fact that everyone knew he wanted to be traded, and they were being asked about it every day. It's like there's no winning really. Besides, there's no way to politely ask out of a franchise. It's impossible.
It really seems more and more as we go along like emotion is tied into this even more than, and maybe this is just nostalgia. Maybe I'm, not remembering some of the drama when I was a younger basketball fan, like growing up in the 90s. But it really does seem like more and more like this is a relationship. Like you don't want to break up. You don't want to hurt that person, but it's always going to hurt.
It's always going to hurt. And it's every fan base. They'll never really forgive a guy. I will say this, and this wasn't a trade, but Kawhi seems like the only guy who has left a team and everyone's just okay with it because he gave him a championship. He was there for a year, gave him a championship, and then was gone. And how you can't really replicate that if you're Dame Lillard, Bradley Beal, anyone else that would eventually want to get traded. I will say I do think Karl Anthony Towns could justifiably say to Wolves fans like, hey, like I really tried. I would like to leave. Like Kevin Garnett. To talk about the Wolves, Kevin Garnett's the only guy it seems like that left. But he also
like a lot of people were happy for him. Yeah.
He didn't really want to leave Minnesota even at that time.
That's true.
So
yeah. The only one. That's an excellent point. I want to get your opinion, Mike, on the news of the day. That's Media Day. And one of the big topics was the vaccination status of multiple players. And I just want to get your insight to how this is going to affect the rest of the season from a camaraderie standpoint. What's going on with Kyrie, with his press conference that took place. If you're listening to this was a Monday, September 27th, during his, I guess you would call it, private media day at his residence or whatever he was staying at. What do you get the feeling of players around the league in terms of their feelings among players who don't want to get vaccinated? Do you feel like, hey, it's their choice, it's that's on them, or do you think there's going to be some resentment with their teammates not getting the vaccine because it's going to cost them games and cost their team potentially a championship or playoff standing down the line? What is your general feeling on how this is going to affect the season?
Well, I think Kyrie's situation is different than so Bradley Beal was one who spoke about, his skepticalness about the vaccine and getting the vaccine. What's the value of it? Kyrie's is different just because and like Andrew Wiggins is in this class. He plays in a city that he is not by a local ordinance is not allowed to play in unless he is vaccinated. Visiting players who are unvaccinated can play in New York City and San Francisco. I think LA may be on the list, but I'm not sure. But if you're, and this is just how the rule is, if you are a player for the Knicks or Nets and you are unvaccinated, you cannot practice or play in New York City. And so if you're Bradley Beal, DC doesn't have that rule as far as I know, and I live right outside DC. So it's a situation where you're one of his teammates. Ultimately, it doesn't really impact you all that much, right? Of course, Bradley he had COVID once and he could get it again. And, that would impact it, but it doesn't, he's not missing home games. Kyrie is going to miss games unless if he gets the vaccine or if he gets a religious or medical exemption, which basically no one gets. So what will that do? The Nets are this really unique case because ultimately they do still have James Harden and Kevin Durant. I would think that it would wear thin on KD and Harden if Kyrie just sits out every home game. But that's just a guess. We don't know. They both said, Kevin Durant was asked about Kyrie's vaccination deal, and he basically said, I expect to have the whole team at some point, hinting that maybe Kyrie will get the vaccine at some point down the road. But it comes back to if he hasn't gotten it already, then what's going to make him change his mind? So the thing about basketball, right, is that I think the way the NBA's rules are, it won't impact the league as much as like the NFL, where you have quarterbacks who, if they're unvaccinated, like Kirk Cousins, if they're in close contact, they then miss the next game. Like it just happens because of the days. Where in the NBA, like I don't like if Kyrie misses 3 games, that stinks for the Nets. If Bradley Beal misses 3 games, that stinks for the Wizards. But it also, it's case by case. But Kyrie could miss 41 home games if he doesn't, get the vaccine, which is his decision, right?
Yeah. I want to get your insight, Mike, on this season overall, because we've talked to some journalists and hardcore fans that seem to have some resentment in terms of how the Lakers and the Nets stacked the roster, and it seems to be a foregone conclusion that the Nets and Lakers are going to be in the NBA Finals. And so, what's the even point of watching this regular season? Where do you lie on kind of this argument? Because we've heard some people be optimistic. Hey, like that's why they play the games. A perfect example was last year. I mean, people expected the Nets to be in the NBA final. So, Kevin Durant steps his foot on the line. The rest is history with Milwaukee. So what's your expectations and excitement level for this season? Where do you lie in terms of, your optimism per se?
I mean, I think this is going to be one of the most exciting seasons that we have seen in such a long time. I mean, if you just go through, like I just pulled up the NBA standings so I could reference this properly. Like if you look at almost each team that is considered a contender or almost a contender, they all have something to prove. They're all on a comeback trail. I mean, the 76ers were the number 1 seed in the East last year. And obviously they have the drama that's happening there. The Nets were the best team, but they had injuries, right? And so we're finally going to see the big three play together, except for home games because Kyrie won't get vaccinated. Allegedly, we don't know for sure. The Bucks trying to repeat. Giannis is trying to make history on his own. Like being in this class of player where if he can repeat, that is a super rare thing in the NBA. The Knicks, are they are they really stable? Like if they do this for a year two, that would show that Leon Rose and Wes are the best shepherds of this team since Van Gundy and Dave Checketts and Patrick Ewing were at the Garden. Hawks, super exciting. Miami Heat got Kyle Lowry. And then if you go to the West, it's like the Jazz were the best team last year in the Western Conference and blew it in the playoffs. The Suns were the ultimate surprise, one of the biggest surprises we ever had. Can they do it again? Right? Jokic is following up an MVP season. Luka, is he going to be the MVP? For the Trailblazers, is Dame going to want to get out? And then you go to the 7th seed, who was last year. It's the Lakers, who are probably, if not the Nets, the co-favorites in the NBA to win the title. And I didn't even mention the Warriors. The Warriors are back. So there's like all these teams and all this drama, and I much prefer this over what it became with the Warriors when they had KD, and it was just like they were just, besides injuries, they were going to win, right? So this, to me, I know that the Lakers Nets are prohibitive favorites, but I could definitely, you could see, I think, another bundle of teams. The Bucks, I do think the Heat, if they played the Nets, would give the Nets a lot of trouble because of the way they can switch defensively. And out west, yeah, the Lakers, but I think there's a lot more of an ability for Western Conference teams to take on I don't feel like the Lakers are a juggernaut yet. I mean, particularly in the playoffs, because Russell Westbrook's just going to be an experiment that we won't know the answer till we get to the playoff time.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's going to be very entertaining. It could be a train wreck. It could work perfectly. We have to wait and see this in terms of how those pieces fit together. Mike, thank you very much for appearing on the show. Really appreciate the chat. Can you let our viewers and listeners know where they can find you on social media, and then any other projects that you're up to as well for the rest of the year?
Yeah, so I'm at Mike Smeltz on Twitter, which, not that much activity, but follow me. I'll tweet out the random. I'm a Washington football team fan, so I'll tweet out the random thought. But for anyone who hasn't listened to Shattered, if you're an NBA fan, you're going to love it. If I could recommend just one episode, I mean, there's some other crazy stuff in there. The last episode, there's some really wild stuff about James Dolan that no one has ever known before and that we reveal. But the episode about the decision, LeBron's decision, is my favorite because we get the former White House press secretary talking about what President Obama was thinking. during the time President Obama was pushing for LeBron to go to the Bulls. And we spoke to Edie Falco from The Sopranos, because The Sopranos, the show had ended, and her and James Gandolfini, who was the lead actor in The Sopranos, Tony Soprano, of course, they did a skit for the Knicks pitch video, and it was the last time that those two had ever done those characters. It was for LeBron, and we have Edie Falco describing that, and there's like a lot more funny, hilarious, embarrassing stuff that is in that episode. So if you haven't listened, it's Shattered, Hope, Heartbreak, and the New York Knicks. Dive. It's just a blast. Episode 4, The Decision. If you don't like anything else but the Knicks, that episode's the safest place to be. It's really I'm proud of it. It's a good series.
Well, I appreciate your work on it, Mike, and it is a must listen to, not only for Knicks fans, for just NBA fans as a whole. In terms, I love the first episode too, in terms of just how just the origin of how James Dolan came to be the owner of the Knicks. I think that's very fascinating. Yeah. His father too, just all that information, really in depth. Really enjoyed the series. Appreciate it, Mike.
All right, thank you guys so much for having me. This was so much fun.